Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Hello and welcome once again to the Occultae Veritatis podcast. Sage is not able to join us. She's stuck in the frozen north. She's going to have a freer schedule in the future, but for now we have some people on distance recording. Who are you people?
Richard Bigley.
Leon Filger.
Sup, bruh? This is Thad. I sell Bitcoin and NFT on this. Sorry, this is Soundboard Demon. Thought we were still doing the bro thing.
It's all pretty evil anyway.
Wall to wall.
Also, Thad is the worst name.
It's okay. If your name is Thad, please join the Patreon for like $1 a month, and Richard Bigley will defend you against the Soundboard Demon who seems to be making fun of you. So, Thad, I am talking to you directly. Please join the Patreon under Team Bigley. Thank you.
Also, you can join our Discord once you get on the Patreon, and I can tell you your name's dumb to your face.
For $6.66 a month, you can have a demon attacking you and Richard being your emotional shield. So sign up today.
I think you're great. Thank you, Thad, for everything you do.
It's short for Thaddeus. Come on.
Well, Thad, just like everybody else out there, descended from just a few humans 300,000 years ago. But before we go back in ancient history to tell our brief story, let's have some poison.
So, what's your poison?
I'm smoking. How do you pronounce it? It's not Jack Herrera.
It is Jack Herrera.
That's how you say it?
You have some?
Yeah.
Where did you get it? My Christ, can I buy some off of you?
Sure. Yeah.
Because that was like my strain back in the day. I would kill to have some. Fuck, man. Okay, as soon as we're done this recording, I'm going to get you some cash and we're going to get me some of that Jack Herrera. And Richard Bigley and I smoked it back then as well also.
It was a good strain. I think it won like a number of different like awards and like cannabis cups and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would love to have some again.
Oh, I'll sell you some just after the episode here.
Perfect.
And I think it still might be available on the website, but I'll have to double check on that.
I'm curious, can we like legally mail weed to Patreons who are Canadian and above the age of 19 or whatever?
I believe we can. I believe any private citizen can mail any other private citizen some weed.
Okay, yeah, I don't know.
Canadians can send cannabis to other adults of legal age. Shipments must follow federal, provincial, and municipal government regulations. View those there. So yeah, we can sell pot.
Fucking awesome.
Well, we can't
Not
sell it.
pot. We can't sell pot. We could send pot.
Give little samples.
Hey, if you're a Canadian, here we go. This is what I'm going to offer you. If you're a Canadian, email the podcast and I can send you some of my homegrown stuff. I'll send you a little bit. But you got to prove your age and we'll give us the Canadian address to send it to. And yeah, once you prove your age and give us a Canadian address, I can package some up, ship some your way. It'll be what's grown in my basement. Please note the lawyers have told us that we take no legal responsibility for anything that happens as a result of your consumption of mystery weed from Richard Bigley's basement.
Email us at whatever the hell email address you're...
feedback@offpod.ca.
Send us a picture or a scan of your driver's license, and then we will send you the weed.
And the Canadian address you want us to send it to.
But also, like, we're totally not going to do any of this, and it's totally not a thing that we would ever actually do. So definitely don't do it, but maybe do it.
Definitely not. No, for legal
But
reasons.
definitely no.
Definitely not.
Legally
for
don't
legal
send us an
legal
email
reasons. Yeah, definitely don't. No,
with
don't.
any of that. You know.
I don't even know what weed is.
This is all satire anyway. This is just a satire show.
I know dandelion's a weed.
It's true. We'll send you dandelions.
You're smoking
Wink,
dandelions. Is that a thing?
I'm friends with Doctor Who.
I'm just a voice actor. Leon Filger is a character I've created.
Wink.
He is not an extension of my own personality.
I am actually legitimately a demon, though. These people are all actors. I'm the only real one.
But yeah, so don't email us asking for weed because there won't be any forthcoming. I can assure you, for legal reasons.
Do not send that email to feedback@offpod.ca.
Alrighty, should we talk about human history?
Sure.
We didn't even fucking do poisons yet, did we?
Well, we talked about Jack Herrera and then got into a whole thing about it, so that might just be poisonous. Jack Herrera?
Can I talk about my poison?
Yeah, talk about your poison.
Okay, my poison is chocolate-flavored Soylent. It's a meal replacement drink. It's delicious, and it contains a whole bunch of important macro and micronutrients. And it's delicious. It tastes like melted chocolate ice cream.
And it's made of people, right?
It is
not
made of people.
It's not made of people. It's made of soybeans.
Like wink, wink soybeans?
Yeah, wink, wink. You know, it's made of.
Yeah.
I've seen Soylent Green.
Wink, wink. Soylent's made of soybeans. Wink, wink. Don't send us an email. We get it.
Wait, I heard about this.
Exactly.
Nick Fuentes talks about these soy boys. Are they grinding up these soy boys to make this Soylent?
Gold. Fucking comedy gold. You're great.
Leon Filger doesn't get to go to hell because he's already there.
Oh, well.
He's probably flipping you both off in the same room, eh?
I hope so. I probably deserve it.
Currently, yes.
Okay.
What do you rate your Soylent?
8 out of 10. I hope it makes my guts feel better.
We got Leon Filger, the original soy boy.
Alrighty. Let's talk about the history of humanity.
Modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, people capable of profound intellectual reasoning, of sophisticated communication, the communication not only of facts, but of thoughts and concepts and ideas. People capable of emotion, of loving, of hating, of laughing, of frowning. Ourselves, in all our bewildering and fascinating diversity. Where, when, and how did anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, first evolve? Charles Darwin himself expressed a belief that Africa was the cradle of humankind. He did so on the basis of the high number of apes in that continent, and he had stressed through his theory of evolution and natural selection the close anatomical relationships between humans and apes. This, of course, horrified the Victorians, who did not want to be thought of as having been descended from apes. And, as we've seen, Charles Darwin was correct. Africa was the cradle of humankind. But an increasing body of new information, especially cutting-edge genetic research, has shown that the same continent was probably also the cradle of modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, as well. Now, this is a remarkable about-face, because for years, archaeologists considered tropical Africa a cultural backwater. Its moment in the spotlight of human prehistory, they said, was with the origins of humans. It was the cradle of humankind. But after that, tropical Africa quietly vegetated, isolated from the rest of the world by the vast spaces of the Sahara. You can hardly blame them for this point of view, not because of racism or anything like that, but simply because of the lack of evidence. There were only a handful of archaeologists throughout tropical Africa. When I first worked there in the early 1960s, there were about 12. Thousands of square miles. Between them, over many years, they found a handful of archaic-looking human skulls and thousands of crude stone artifacts. Fortunately, New fossil discoveries, as well as molecular biology, have painted a very different picture of later human evolution south of the Sahara. Africa was a crucible of human evolution and a crucible of innovation for thousands of years.
So, just as some caveats, the topic of human history is hotly contested. I made a bunch of decisions here today just so I can tell a story, but almost everything I'm going to mention has a yeah but, and if I had an archaeologist on that knew what they were talking about, they would be able to yeah but me until the cows come home. So, yeah, make sure to use this episode as a jumping off point to learn more about human history and not as the definitive model. Sometimes I'm just picking what I think is the best explanation for stuff and using that in the story, but regardless. How far do human beings go back? So you're a human, I'm a human, you guys as parents are humans, your grandparents are humans. How far do you have to go back until you find something that isn't a human?
At least 26 years.
I guess, yeah, when you were haploids, right? Or why 26 years?
I don't know, because I was 10.
It's true. 8-year-olds actually aren't human yet.
If we go back 375 million years ago, 180 million grandparents ago, our 180 millionth grandparent was Tiktaalik, which is a lobed fish that first crawled out of the oceans millions and millions of years ago.
I made a post about that.
Yeah. I read a book that said, like, your grandfather the fish or something like that, and it was quite enlightening. It showed how, like, all the little bones and that little lobe fin eventually became the bones in our hand and all kinds of cool stuff like that.
The arrival of plants on land had stimulated a surge in life in and around freshwater swamps, and this created new opportunities for the fish that lived here.
One of the niches that was being developed at that time was for shallow water predators. You know, which fish could find other fish that were living in the shallows, the swamps, the productive ecosystems that were just starting to appear on Earth at that time.
Ted Deschler and his colleagues believed that limb-like fins could have helped a fish to hunt in this kind of environment. And then, on the slopes of a barren valley, they made a thrilling discovery.
This was the fossil that got us really excited. We couldn't have dreamed, actually, that we would find something as well preserved as this one.
The team found features that matched the profile of a shallow water predator.
One of the really amazing aspects of Tiktaalik that we've noticed is this evolution of the neck. There was not a rigid connection between the skull and the rest of the body. Tiktaalik is the first vertebrate we see that has freed up the neck. And when you think about it, all limbed animals, including ourselves, would not be able to move our head independently of our shoulders if it were not for these innovations that were occurring in a form like Tiktaalik.
A flexible neck allowed Tiktaalik to point its jaws at its prey when space was too cramped to maneuver its whole body. But it was the fins that provided the team with the most exciting evidence. Behind the spiny rays, there were lobe-like stumps like those of the coelacanth. But Tiktaalik's bones revealed a pattern that was much closer to the basic structure of limbs.
We learned a lot about the fin of Tiktaalik from this specimen. I'm a lobe-fin fish. Here is my front fin. We call it a limb now, but here is Tiktaalik's front fin. So this is the humerus. We all have a humerus. That's the first bone in the front appendage. We have a ulna and a radius. So you and I, all limbed animals, have an ulna and radius. We have some wrist bones, and so when we see all of these features, we see a structure which is very much like our limbs. So here is a fish using its fin in a very limb-like way.
Tiktaalik heavy-duty fin still helped it to swim. But if it hit the shallows, the bones and joints would help to push itself up and punt around. But this new limb didn't just help mobility in the water. It became the driving force behind one of the most spectacular events in evolutionary history. The arrival of the first vertebrate animals on land.
But too far back, not a human. So let's go back 45 million generations ago. So our 45 millionth grandfather was Morgan Yucodon. This creature was tiny, about 4 inches long and about an ounce, as much as a AA battery. It looks much like a modern-day shrew, although it's not a shrew, because Morgan Yucodon is considered to be the first mammal during the late Triassic period. Why? It was covered in hair. It seemed to have an active metabolism that cold blood would not allow for. When its young were born, it nursed them with milk. There is debate as to whether or not it gave birth to live young, or laid eggs that hatched like modern monotremes, but this isn't unusual for early mammals, to lay eggs. The point is, what hatched from those eggs is now considered to be one of the first mammals, or at least a very late transitional stage between mammals and reptiles. And this is one of our oldest ancestors, the first mammal. Even if somehow miraculously we were able to evolve despite the first mammal not existing, we would all be laying in the sun for the better part of our days trying to gain enough energy to move and do our chores if mammals did not evolve. So, Morgan Yucodon, you are our first mammal ancestor, but you're not a human yet. So where did the first human come in? So let's bring it forward a bit, but still far back. 1.5 million years ago. Homo erectus. First we were fish developing our fins to step onto dry land, then we were little shrew-like animals, and 1.5 million years ago, or 79,000 generations ago, we were Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus was not a human. That is, Homo sapien sapien, but it was a lot like us. It walked upright. It had thumbs that it used to grasp and manipulate things, such as stone tools. That's right, humans didn't invent stone tools. Homo erectus did. It had culture. It might have had religion, beliefs, language. We don't know because it was before any ability for us to record any kind of history, but Homo erectus was a lot like us, except not human. But it was the creature that humans would descend from. In fact, as far as modern science can tell, it is our direct ancestor. We go from Homo erectus to Homo sapien.
Anyway, our hero is Homo erectus. I'm always intrigued to discover new findings in the literature about the accomplishments of Homo erectus, because we tend to really downgrade Homo erectus. You know, if you're old enough to remember the American comedian Rodney Dangerfield, you know his line is, "I don't get no respect." That's how I feel about Homo erectus at times. Everybody's impressed with the latest artwork from Neanderthals or sapiens, but erectus is really where it all started. In fact, in recent study published, it was discovered that Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens in Africa, have DNA evidence that shows that they interbred with a Homo species that existed prior to the split of Neanderthals and sapiens. Well, that's Homo erectus. Homo sapiens and erectus coexisted for many years together. In fact, Homo erectus is the most successful species in the history of our genus Homo. So they existed from 1.8 million years ago to about 140,000 years ago, some would say even more recently. They're far more successful than we are. They existed well over 1 million years longer than Homo sapiens has existed. Their height was between 5'8" and 5'11", so they weren't little Australopithecines. They were big guys. They had, big bones. They could have pretty much taken on any Homo sapiens walking around. They were wide-ranging polymorphic species. They had a lot of variation in skull size and physical strength. And they arguably did possess a modern vocal apparatus. From what we can tell from the... it's very difficult to find the small little bones that define a modern vocal apparatus, but in recent work there has been discoveries of what appear to be hyoid bones that belong to Homo erectus, which would have meant that they had fairly modern speech capabilities. They were ocean travelers, magnificent tool makers. They invented fire. They started communities. Much of what we take for granted as human accomplishments are human accomplishments. They're just from a non-sapient species of human.
Something evolved from Homo erectus to become Homo sapiens.
I'm Homo erectus.
Oh, yes. This whole topic makes me Homo erectus. It's fun to talk about.
You know how much it costs me to get Homo erectus every time I need to? $16. That's the fucking generic Vardanafil that's the cheapest you can get in this country. So like each boner I get costs me $16.
I guess it gives you an incentive to make it worth it, though.
Oh, make it worth it for sure. Like we're going 3 times a night, but fuck me, that's a lot of money.
A whole $16 worth of sex,
It's a good thing you're not having to be in high school math class anymore, because that would get real expensive every day for at least 15 minutes while you're looking at integrals.
Where was the first human? That's the tricky thing about evolution. There wasn't a first human. It's like if I give you a couple thousand paint swatches, and on one end you have blue, and on the other end you have purple. It's nearly impossible to pick out exactly where the turn from blue to purple is. It's a gradual change over time, and each individual in a species is just like one instance of that species. They mostly look like their parents and are the same species as their parents, and the kids they give birth to are their own species and are the same species as them and look like them. And it's such a gradual change over time that you really don't have a first human. The reason we have different species is because we don't have all those little steps in between. We have these singular snapshots of this gradual process where things are different enough that they appear like different species. But really, there was no first human. We have a point in archaeology where we think humans emerged. So it isn't really a first human. It's kind of like a very gray line where we become distinct enough to be called a different species. And that happens about 350,000 years ago. You guys want to guess which modern country we were first detected in?
Botswana.
Nope, not Botswana.
Fuck. Can I guess again? Morocco?
Yeah, our first ancestors detected, like the first remains we found, were in Morocco. There was about 10,000 of us back then, just a small population of humans, and we were living in a limestone cave in Morocco. If you took one of these old Moroccan humans, these first Homo sapiens, and you gave them a day of modern hygiene and a change of clothes, they wouldn't look all that different. Their heads were more egg-shaped, they had bigger teeth, they couldn't really form words quite yet, they didn't have the genetics to control their mouth quite yet, but they would be mostly passable as humans today.
A team of scientists in Morocco have found the fossil remains of 5 individuals they believe are the most ancient modern humans ever found. At about 300,000 years old, they are 100,000 years older than other Homo sapiens remain.
The discovery was made in a remote area of Morocco called Jebel Ihud. The team found a skull, bones and teeth of 5 individuals who lived about 300 and 1,500,000 years ago.
There is one issue, which is the timing and the place. So the timing is much older than we thought. It's not 200,000, it's probably more than 300,000. Then there is the notion that our species by this time was already represented all over Africa, not just in a little Garden of Eden somewhere.
The scientists also found fairly sophisticated stone tools and charcoal, indicating the use of fire by this group. The researchers' claim is controversial though, as anthropologists are still debating exactly what physical features distinguished modern humans from more primitive ancestors.
But I think probably the main contribution of our works is to show that modern humans did not appear in a sort of Adamic way, quickly, immediately displaying all the features of extant humans. It's a gradual process, it's a long process, and it's a complex process. And we see that in the Jebeli Wood humans, we have part of the anatomy that is already very close to what we see in living humans, but other parts that are still have still to undergo a long evolutionary process, especially the brain.
So what did we start out with? We started out with a lot of technology that was passed down to us. Like I said, we evolved from Homo erectus, and Homo erectuses are still going to be around for a long time in our history. But we were able to take a bunch of stuff that they developed before us, because they were on the Earth 1.5 million years before we even showed up, and they developed a whole bunch of stuff. Firstly, they had fire, and those early humans that long ago, we ate a variety of animals. We had horses and antelopes and gazelles, bovines, and we were able to use fire to get more nutrients from them.
Do you think they had anal sex?
Oh, they definitely had anal sex. They had anal sex like before they were humans. Like Homo erectus was fucking each other in the ass, I'm pretty sure.
However, scientists have observed animals engaging in anal sex, though.
Oh, it's true. Like, it predates humanity. That's why, like, I have no problem saying that it definitely happened, 100%. But yeah, we used fire. The advantages the fire gives us is it allows us to get more calories from what we eat. Like, gorillas spend about 80% of their waking hours eating. They're big lumbering beasts. They can smash through. They're a lot stronger than us. They seem a lot mightier, but they have to spend a lot of their day just chewing through raw plant matter to keep them running. Early humans, by comparison, were only spending about 5% of their time eating because we had fire. We could cook. It broke down plant cell walls, and it also denatured protein, which allowed us to get way more calories for way less chewing out of food. We also had stone tools. The first humans had flints in particular, and we actually got the third version of flint and stone tools. It's like iPhones. Homo erectus came up with the iPhone 1, the stone tool 1, and they came up with the stone tool 2. And what we got when we emerged on the scene 300,000 years ago was actually stone tool 3, the third version. The first version of the stone tool were basically just large stones that they smacked together, and part of the stone broke off, and the sharp part was used to cut things. The second mode, the stone was more deliberately carved, usually in a teardrop shape, and both sides of the stone were carved. And then we got the third point, what was called the Mousterian stone tools. They all have these fancy names. It's actually called the Mousterian industry because there was an entire industry of building these stone tools amongst Paleolithic people. And these Mousterian tools had really sharp points, and they could also be shaped into a bunch of different points. So not only did we have these very basic teardrop cutters, we started to have scrapers and choppers and things we can make into knives and axes. Why are stone tools important? Number one, it allowed us to murder megafauna. We have an entire extinction event that is based off us. So stone tools helped us get to that level, get to the level of murdering megafauna.
But it's what humans are best at. You guys love to murder.
It also allowed us to strip a skeleton more completely of meat. We've all been to wing night at a bar. There's only so much you can get off of bones with your teeth, and that's cooked meat. But with stone tools, we were able to harvest more. It also gave us a bigger command of our environment. You can only dig so far in dirt. You can only chop so much material with your hands, if you can at all, like ripping tree branches off. So having stone tools allowed us to do what our hands couldn't, to dig in hard soil, to cut and shape wood, all that different stuff. We also inherited religious habits. Neanderthals started burying their dead around 300,000 years ago. They lined graves with flowers and animal parts. And they had totem worship, mostly involving animals and other natural gods. And early humans, when we emerged, seemed to have started out with all this stuff. We also had temporary shelter. Shelters actually predate humanity. There were examples of Homo erectus setting up these big wooden shelters. They would dig a little bit in the soil and they would use rocks to prop tree branches up to make a little tent over top. And some of these structures were pretty big. There was one found in modern day France that was 50 feet long and several feet wide, able to contain like a whole tribe full of these people. Human beings arrived on the fray 300,000 years ago. We had fire. We could cook things so we could get lots of calories from our environment. We had the Stone Tool 3, the most updated and modern form of the stone tool. We had religious habits from our Neanderthal buddies, and we had temporary shelters. Here's where we start. This is our starting line as far as history is concerned. What is the first thing that you think we do when we start to move into Eastern Africa out of our home in Morocco?
Fuck the Neanderthals.
Well, Richard, you're not wrong. We were interbreeding with pretty much every hominid we came across, including the ones we evolved from, because they were still around, Homo erectus. But we definitely fuck something, but not in the pleasurable way. The first thing we do is probably a genocide, most likely. Homo naledi is one of the humans, one of the Homo species that are walking around with us. And actually, there's 9 other Homo species that are walking around as we are on the Earth in ancient history. One of them is Homo naledi. It's from our most primitive ancestor, like it's the one that's most ape-like. They probably couldn't walk very far on 2 legs, although they could. They had sophisticated, dexterous hands, a brain likely capable of making tools, but they didn't seem to be able to make tools. And they mostly lived in the trees, but they were one of our most ancient ancestors, most ape-like.
Archaeologists don't use the word primitive. They would say basal, as opposed to lesser, more advanced, which would be derived.
Yeah, because evolution doesn't work like that. So basal, I like that. Yeah, one of our most basal relatives.
A couple of years ago, Lee Berger and colleagues started to uncover exciting new material from the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. And what they found is thousands of bones representing at least 15 individuals of a new human species, Homo naledi. Seems to be a very primitive member of our own genus, the genus Homo. So it is human, but a very primitive human with a small brain and some mixtures of primitive and what we could call derived features. So naledi in its feet is much more human than Sediba is. But in the upper body, yes, it's largely human, but it still has some odd features in its shoulder, in its arms, and it's got curved digits on its hands, really very curved. So again, even for naledi, it looks like it retained directly or maybe through its ancestry some ability to climb in the trees, even at that stage. And of course, we don't know if this tree climbing was because of diet, because they were going up in the trees to feed, and certainly for the earliest hominins, I'm sure it was that they were feeding up in the trees. But for the later ones, possibly they're going up in the trees at night for defense. So you wouldn't want to have your babies at ground level in a dangerous environment with saber-toothed cats and leopards and hyenas around. That would be a bad thing unless you've got a safe place to put your children. So possibly going up into the trees was also a mechanism for sleeping at night more safely. Although we've got it in the exhibition and we've put it on our evolutionary diagram at the beginning, of course, we don't know how old it is. It could be 2.5 million years old, it could be 50,000 years old, and that work is still ongoing in placing it. And I would say probably lies close to the origins of the human genus. In our exhibition, we've tried to show the diversity of humans and even pre-humans, that we have to get away from this idea that there's this simple march of progress leading from a primitive ape man, so-called ape person, through to us today. We are not the pinnacle of a predestined evolutionary sequence. We had a radiation of different species through time, many of them. We're the only survivors of all of those radiations of early human evolution, and we want to show that diversity and the fact that there was nothing preordained about our own evolution and our eventual success.
When we moved into Eastern Africa, suddenly their populations diminished and disappeared, just as we were arriving. Now, what you do after you commit a genocide against a fellow human species is invent glue. Glue was one of the first inventions that humanity ever came up with.
Are they related?
They might be. Who knows, right? And actually, they might be related because our ability to make glue allowed us to make better spears. The way we build spears before this, we didn't even have, we had some hafting, which means we could use some plant fibers to attach it, but sometimes that did not stay all that well. And our hafting wasn't very sophisticated. We couldn't wrap a stone tool into a stick very well. But what we could do was glue it really well. And we used the first form of glue that we ever invented, made of pine tar, to bind stone tools to wooden handles, allowing us to get really good spears. And maybe we use those really good spears to commit the first genocide of our species. The first recorded, I suppose. This is jumping forward. You see that development is very slow off the start, but it'll pick up. So we emerged 300,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, we got glue. 171,000 years ago, we got heat treating. Heat treating wood has benefits and drawbacks. A benefit is the wood gets harder, so it has better penetrative power, just like Leon when he takes a special pill. It has better slashing power, but it becomes more brittle and prone to fracturing. So
just like the pills, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Would you say that your penis is more prone to fracturing when it's on those pills?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely it is.
And also better at slashing?
It's better at slapping. It's not so much better at slashing.
Well, but the piercing damage?
I haven't tested that. I don't know. I mean, it would depend on the material I was trying to pierce. Like some soft drywall, maybe. I don't know.
You'll have to do some research and get back to the patrons. I'm sure they're really wanting to know.
Tell you what, if the patrons want to send me $16, I'll take one of my pills and try to smack my dick into various things.
Yeah, so Leon's cock is a good analog for heat treating. So much like Leon's cock, gets harder, it can penetrate harder, but it's also more prone to fracturing. So, an early man could do a lot with that kind of leverage. They could stab harder, but their sticks would break more. And what these early men were using it for when they first heat-treated sticks was not fucking other things, unfortunately, but it was digging holes. Apparently the sticks they were using before might have been too soft to dig in this hard soil, but they heat-treated these sticks and they were able to dig a hole real good. So about 150,000 years ago, so pretty soon after our heat-treated wood invention, the glaciers start to melt and they start to release their moisture. And that's something that glaciers do over and over again, and you'll see it affect human history as I keep on talking here, is when a glacier forms, it steals a lot of the moisture from the air in the oceans, and it causes waters to recede and precipitation to stop. So when they start melting, the opposite of that happens. We actually had a green event about 150,000 years ago, and we were able to travel to all the different areas of Africa. The huge deserts that spread across Africa before shrunk, and humanity was able to travel and grow in number. So the last time we tuned in, our population was growing and we did a migration, we had a genocide. Do you guys want to guess what happens this time?
More genocide?
Is it still genocide if it's animals?
Yeah.
An extinction event, I guess.
Yeah, I guess a genocide of sorts, a genocide of non-human species, but basically our population growing and us spreading to all the different corners of Africa kicks off something called the Quaternary Extinction. and it's defined by the disappearance of most animals above 40 kilograms. Most animals above 40 kilograms went extinct because of two causes. One, natural climate change. The glaciers are shrinking and growing and shrinking and growing, and stuff is going through droughts and floods all throughout our history here. So a lot of large animals have problems adapting. But number two is probably humanity. A lot of these animals that went extinct, their remains have weapon marks that may have come from us. It seems like we were a hungry little species and we hunted and harvested to our heart's content and eliminated almost everything above 40 kilograms.
Both Hollywood and modern illustrated depictions show brave hunters thrusting spears into these giant beasts, which obviously makes no sense. You're well within the kill range of these giant tusks that can smash your organs, even if it doesn't kill you outright, and then only to be trampled by 10 tons of prehistoric elephant, if you want to compare it to something that we have today. And imagine taking a spear, whether it be an at-lateral thrown spear or a thrusting spear, and trying to penetrate through these bones. It's a nearly impossible task. And if you focus on the side, where you may only have a 50-50 shot of penetrating between ribs as opposed to hitting them, and the ribs will surely stop any sort of projectile. I mean, these animals were incredibly intelligent, much like modern-day elephants, in the fact that their defense system is going to be more on the offense as opposed to the defense. They're not going to turn and run from you. They're going to come at you and attack you. So a front-on attack between the armor that the bones present, the tough skin of the animal, and then the defensive weapons between the weight and the tusks of these makes a frontal attack almost out of the question if you want to walk out of here with your life. Attacking this animal from the rear would be your safest and freest option as far as getting a spear to penetrate or an at-lateral even from a distance, because there's no protection in this gut belly area, and he's very vulnerable here. Now, we think in modern day terms of ethical hunting. Remember, these people were not trying to be ethical. They were trying to survive, and they were trying to live and escape this encounter with their life. And all it takes is one spear to the guts, and this animal will die. That may take 24 to 48 hours to do so, but all you need is one, and then you run away, watch the animal, and eventually it will succumb to being septic. And if you have 2 or 3 people set up, say you got one person over here hunting, one person over here, somebody in the front trying to keep its attention, and then you have somebody in the back, as this animal swings around to attack somebody new, whoever's now from behind can come and deliver between the legs up into this area. And actually around the anal vent, there's a lot of blood vessels, and if you actually pierce that lining, an animal can bleed out rather fast. So this is actually going to be your safest attack point.
You know, all the big animals that survive today are the ones that have survived us, or were far enough away that we didn't get to them.
Just a quick throwback here. The definition of genocide does seem to specifically mention people, but I think the term you're looking for is anthropogenic extinction event, as in caused by humans.
That's what I said.
Yeah, I said the bigger word for it.
Oh yeah, and at this point we start to get brave. So we start a mass extinction again. We're starting to get cocky. You know, the weather's nice. We decide to go for a long walk. This is our first expedition out of Africa. So the glaciers are melting, and it revealed a bunch of routes north that weren't there before. And early humans made a break for it. They went to 2 places. They went to the Middle East, and they went to India. And funny enough, none of our DNA comes from these humans that venture out, which means that these humans are likely gonna encounter a terrible fate, but we'll tune into them later. But 125,000 years ago, humanity sets forth and escapes Africa into the Middle East and India. 114,000 years ago, we discovered shame. We discovered that our naked bodies are gross and to be hidden from the world, and we invented clothing, or at least started to wear clothing.
I'm not sure it would be as a result of shame. Like, part of me is thinking, well, things are getting colder or whatever, we're going to want to wear that to cover up, or if you're in a dangerous environment, that extra clothing provides protection. Kind of like how if you're on a motorcycle, you want to wear your leathers. Same sort of deal.
Oh yeah, I was trying to make a joke. No, we didn't invent it because of shame. I'm surely humans didn't have prolifications about their dicks being out. But yeah, exactly what Richard said. It can insulate us from the cold weather and hot weather. It can protect our skin from radiation damage, and it can provide like a hygienic barrier between you and the toxic, stingy, bitey environment. But the thing is, clothing doesn't really last. Something that I found interesting here is we actually discovered that humans started wearing clothing 114,000 years ago, only because of the DNA of lice. So clothes don't last. Clothes won't preserve, but we studied the DNA of lice and discovered that they started hanging out with humans about 114,000 years ago. Even today, like human populations that don't wear much clothes, like the people that live in different areas of the world that wear nothing more than a loincloth because it's hot as fuck out, they don't typically have problems with lice. Lice typically need clothing to hang out on when they're not sucking blood directly from us. So they can't really live on a human body without clothes. So we started wearing clothing about 114,000 years ago because that's when lice started adapting to specifically feed on us. 108,000 years ago, Homo erectus, its population began to decline. It had art, culture, fire, stone tools, and it spread out across the earth before we even arrived. Homo erectus makes me feel fragile as a human because we arrived pretty late in its history. It had already been around for 1.7 million years before we even showed up. And it had spread all over. It was in Africa, it was in Europe, it was in India and China, Indonesia, all over the place. And we don't really know much about its extinction. It happened so long ago we don't have very much evidence, but we know the last family group of Homo erectus were eliminated in one big mass death event that seemed to finish off their species entirely. So we've eliminated another Homo that exists. I keep on alluding that we have taken care of them because I have suspicions.
Another Homo bites the dust.
We then start to develop language. So humanity has come a long ways. We've eliminated a bunch of rivals by now. We started eliminating the megafauna. Now we're going to start to develop language. A gene develops known as the FOXP2 gene. Today, when modern people are missing this gene, they often have problems having enough control over their vocal tract to produce language. With enough practice, they can speak normally, but it takes a lot of training. They're not as able to. This is also when our vocal tract fully developed, like the shape of our tongues and our vocal cords and our mouth and our soft palate only became modern about 100,000 years ago, about the same time that we got this FOXP2 gene. So it's theorized that we were able to pronounce all the consonants and vowels within the human language about 100,000 years ago. So that's probably when modern-like language began.
Something remarkable happens in human development. Our voice box starts a journey down into the neck. Unlike any other mammal, we start in one place, but we end up in another. By the larynx going all the way down in the throat, we get a large area of space above it, which can take the sounds that are produced inside the larynx at what we call the vocal cords or vocal folds, and we can modify them to a greater extent than that possible for any other mammal. We have thus gained the ability for fully articulate speech. The hallmark of our kind is our ability to have fully articulate speech. This is what sets us apart from all other animals, and this is what set us apart from Neanderthals.
Modern science now has the technology to investigate down to the molecular level. Drs. Simon Fisher and Cecilia Lai of the Wellcome Trust Center in England have identified a gene that is involved with speech. It's called FOXP2 and is attached to the human chromosome number 7. They think this gene evolved more recently than 200,000 years, which would suggest that FOXP2 appeared after we had evolved. It might have improved brain functions that are used for language skills, but we don't know as yet.
We think that FOXP2 is a very exciting discovery because it clearly has had a dramatic impact on human speech and language abilities, but it's important to realize that this is just one piece of a bigger puzzle. But the great thing is that we now have a tool we can use FOXP2 to find other elements of the pathway and of the puzzle.
Language is good. It's what, y'all are listening to right now, so...
Proto-Indo-European languages, at least.
That's true.
Oh yeah, proto all the languages, really. 90,000 years ago. So this is where we see what happens to those humans that left Africa earlier. They left 125,000 years ago, so they've been farting around India and the Middle East for about 35,000 years now. Well, the glaciers start to reform with a fury, and a worldwide drought hits the Earth. And like as glaciers do, they steal all the moisture from the seas and the air, and all humans that moved out of Africa died. Because not one genome from their DNA made it into modern humans. It seems that these first humans that ventured out just didn't make it. We didn't hack our first time getting out of Africa.
It's what happens when everything in nature is trying to kill you, I guess, eh?
Yeah, sometimes it succeeds for a bit.
Yeah, and the humans in Africa actually weren't doing much better, and everything in nature is going against it. We just got adapted to this fairly gentle, like sunny environment, and then the ice comes back. And just to kick us when we're down, Toba erupted. Toba is the largest volcanic eruption that has occurred in human existence. Just for a comparison, just to give you an idea of how big it was, its eruption threw 700 square miles of rock, dirt, and volcanic ash into the atmosphere. That's like throwing all of London into the atmosphere, nice and powdered and coated throughout the upper atmosphere. Or 1.5 Phoenix, Arizonas. Or for the Kiwis out there, that's like throwing the entire island of Stewart Island into the atmosphere. Is Kiwis an offensive term? That's a term of endearment, right?
I think they call themselves Kiwis, so I think it's okay.
I mean, New Zealand, when they had an air force, used the Kiwi as their bird for it, a famously flightless bird, I'll add. So they're obviously fond of it.
Yeah. So what did spewing 700 square miles of rock and dirt into the atmosphere do? Well, it eliminated the sun for about 6 years. So imagine not having spring or summer or really even a fall for 6 years. All the plants die. Because the glaciers are still forming, a lot of the water dries up. It stops raining. Almost all the humans die. And so do many other animals. Gorillas, chimpanzees, cheetahs, tigers, hippos, they all go through the same phenomenon of having their populations almost eliminated and then all future members coming from those small populations. We were reduced to about 10,000 individuals. That's it. We went down from about 300,000 to about 10,000 after this eruption of this volcano, and humanity nearly went extinct.
It's almost impossible to imagine the scale of an eruption such as Toba.
But while smaller volcanoes explode to the surface, where their magma hardens into the familiar cone shape, supervolcanoes are chiefly known for storing massive amounts of magma in vast subterranean chambers. Toba's held nearly 1,800 cubic miles of sweltering magma, enough to fill 200 Grand Canyons.
We think that it might have taken 1 million years to accumulate all the magma that was beneath Toba.
As the magma and volcanic gases accumulated, pressure built up in the magma chamber, putting the Earth's crust above under incredible stress.
Magma would have been accumulating beneath this area, doming up the entire terrain.
It certainly would have involved new cracks opening up in the ground.
After millions of years of accumulated pressure, the magma finally erupted, draining the underground reservoir.
The roof of the magma chamber, though, began to collapse and sink into the magma chamber. This forced the silica-rich magma out along the perimeter of this collapsing roof block.
Once the eruption started, all hell would have broken loose.
This magma erupted explosively towards the surface, generating enormous ash clouds and generated pyroclastic flows,
which are very destructive and hot avalanches of gas, ash and rock. And of course they destroy everything in their path.
The mayhem would have continued for days.
Very high eruption columns. These eruption columns would have reached tens of miles into the atmosphere.
The eruption plumes sent billions of tons of ash around the globe, some of which eventually ended up in John Westgate's lab 75,000 years later.
That, for me, was the eureka moment when we had brought all this chemistry together, combined it with the dating, and it all gave this coherent story of one massive eruption 75,000 years ago from Toba.
The cataclysm would have annihilated virtually all life, human, animal, and plant, within a wide radius. Death from breathing in volcanic ash would have been excruciating.
Well, if you're close enough to the volcanic eruption, and in a super eruption that can mean thousands of miles away, if you breathe in the ash in an unprotected way, you're breathing in tiny little glass needles. And they get into your lungs. They cause the blood vessels in your lungs to pop. There's moisture in your lungs. The ash combines with the moisture to make a kind of a cement. You basically choke to death.
Pushing humanity to these limits, to where only the most clever or industrious or well-prepared or lucky humans are able to make it through these 6 years of not having a son. After this, our ability to innovate and create new things goes into overdrive. There's some theories that it was kind of like a way to eliminate all the humans that weren't clever enough to survive, and it left a bunch of clever ones that were able to innovate faster. And we started to invent new things with a fury. 72,000 years ago, we make arrows out of bones. They're very simple. They have no feathers on them. They're not straight, but they're functional. No bow yet. But there's other ways to launch arrows, with an atlatl or just by hand if you're going for something small. 71,000 years ago, we start using beds. The earliest beds were made out of this type of grass that not only provided cushioning, but also had this aroma around them, this oil that coated them that was anti-bug. So had insecticide properties that kept bugs off us as we were sleeping. And we begin to venture out again. 4,000 years after our near extinctions, humans have built up enough gusto and have repopulated enough that they want to venture out again. The glaciers, although they stole a lot of moisture from the seas, have also revealed a bunch of land bridges that were under the water before. And human beings make the journey from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, and we start to travel to the rest of the world. 65,000 years ago, we run into the Neanderthals. We only had very limited contact with them since then, and we fuck, kill, and commingle with many of them, and we trade culture and technology. I think several of you have had a DNA test. How Neanderthal are you all?
I know that Richard Bigley is more Neanderthal than me.
I need to look at my results. I wasn't expecting to have to know that.
No, because remember, I made fun of you for it like years ago when we got the test done.
Oh, I know you did. What does it say here?
I know Geo that's often on, they are more Neanderthal than 81% of people on their DNA thing.
64% more Neanderthal than other customers. It's because I'm like mostly European, I think. I have 248 variants of Neanderthal DNA.
But we got a bunch of genetic mutations that first began in Neanderthals and made it into us because of all the fucking that's happened. And as we see with the host of our podcast here, a lot of people have Neanderthal DNA within them. Number one, it made us have a more strong immune response to certain diseases. There's actually some science and studies going on right now that are saying that those with a higher proportion of Neanderthal DNA may have a higher resistance or may experience more mild COVID-19 illnesses. So it may be protecting us against COVID-19 like right now. There's some evidence for that. It also helps us clot blood faster. So a higher proportion of Neanderthal DNA is related to blood clotting faster. Yeah, so we intermingle with the Neanderthals and we live like beside them, like in the new world as we're trekking out.
For 150 years, scientists have been puzzled by the fate of the Neanderthals. Why such a strong, well-adapted species disappeared? One of the world's leading anthropologists, Ian Tattersall, believes we're to blame. Our ancestors must have forced the Neanderthals into extinction. Homo sapiens, modern humans, evolved in Africa. We didn't set foot on European soil until about 40,000 years ago. But once we did, it was only a matter of time before we ran into the inhabitants of this continent, the Neanderthals.
Modern humans would clearly have seen something very similar to themselves in these creatures that they encountered in this new world that they were entering. But I don't think that they would have identified with each other particularly closely. And I think they would have perceived themselves as being in competition.
Did modern humans simply slaughter the Neanderthals? Or was the interaction more subtle? Instead of killing them, perhaps we outcompeted the Neanderthals. We may have been better at finding different sorts of food. Whatever happened, modern humans, our ancestors, won out. Today it's obvious who dominates the planet. Neanderthals are no more. But anthropologist John Hawkes believes this version of the story is way too simple. He thinks that modern humans were not really so different from the Neanderthals. When they met, our ancestors would have been curious, not hostile.
It would be insane to go out and pick a fight. You're not a military organization going in, looking to conquer. You're a small group yourself. You sort of have to, find a way to live with the locals, and as you do that, you learn from them to some extent. And the locals learn from you. I feel like the defense attorney for the Neanderthals sometimes. I'm trying to see the ways that they overlap with us and trying to add complexity to the story, because any story that involves things happening over a continent over thousands of years, it's got to be complicated.
How far might the overlap have gone? Instead of making war, perhaps they made love.
55,000 years ago, so we're jumping ahead a few years. It's been 15,000 years since we left Africa for the second time, and we're now traveling along the southern trails, kind of just underneath modern-day Russia, ducking under the immense glaciers that are forming there. And by 55,000 years ago, we have reached many locations in modern-day India and southern Asia. And we run into another human-like species that, again, we fucked and interbred with, and we got some of our DNA from, the Denisovans. The Denisovans are kind of mysterious. We don't have very many examples of remains from them, just a few teeth and a few arm bones. What we know most about them is their DNA. Even though there's not many of them left, or not many of them that have been found, a lot of our DNA comes from them. So they made a genetic impact. A couple things that come from their genetics is found in modern Tibetan people. The fact that Tibetan people are able to have more oxygen in their blood at higher altitudes comes from Denisovan DNA. The increased amount of brown fat found in indigenous populations in the far north also comes from Denisovan DNA, so the ability to survive in colder conditions for certain populations of people comes from ancient humans interbreeding with these Denisovans.
It's all because of this. Now, this is part of what you call a bangle or a wrist bracelet, which was found in a place called the Denisova Cave. The importance about this is that, firstly, there's evidence of high-speed drilling actually within the width of it. It's immensely sophisticated, the style of finish. It's a high-status item. You know, it's not obviously for the riffraff or anything. And it was probably worn by an elite woman. And the most important thing is that we weren't around in Siberia at this time. So it has to have been made by one of our predecessors. And since all the evidence of the so-called Denisovans has come out from the same layer, the archaeologists are accepting that this was made by Denisovans, and that changes everything. The next time that this type of technology comes out again is at the beginning of the Neolithic period, around 8,000 BC. We know that that technology goes back at least to 60, 70,000 years and doesn't even belong to us as Homo sapiens. It comes from the Denisovans. So what do we know about the Denisovans themselves? What's actually been found? Well, to date, I know it sounds meagre, but we can make an awful lot from it, is that there's only been 4 pieces of fossil remains of the Denisovans found and confirmed. So we've actually got 3 different teeth and a piece of a little finger, a pinky, as they call it. That's it. That's all we've got. And the important thing about the Denisova Cave is because it's cold there and because of the type of soil, that human remains have been preserved, fossilised in a manner which allows the DNA extraction. That's both nuclear DNA and obviously mitochondrial DNA, which is basically the bacteria, the DNA of our bacteria that's within the body. It's passed on from mother to child. All 4 of the pieces of anatomical evidence that we have so far show that the Denisovans were of large size. And this is brought out, for instance, in one of the tooth here, which is actually referred to in the Nat Geo TV documentary as a giant tooth. All of this tells us that the Denisovans were incredibly large in size, both in girth and also probably in height as well. The Denisovans wore tailored clothing. In other words, they were making their own clothes. So they not only had sophisticated jewellery, but they had tailored clothing as well. DNA evidence has been discovered in the cave, plus actual remains now, of a type of horse that existed 50,000 years ago. An early attempt of equine domestication cannot be ruled out. The Denisovans rode horses. So who exactly were the Denisovans? How do they fit into this? Because they're not Homo sapiens, they're not Neanderthals, the DNA tells us this. What we know is that they're completely unique, and that until something like 2008, we had no idea that they even existed.
50,000 years ago, we started building boats, mostly out of tree trunks that had been scraped with a wooden tool on the inside to make a dugout boat. We also started fucking around with rope by braiding plant fibers together. It reminds me of the time I was in cadets and we started braiding grass rope. We took individual strands of grass and we started doing like French braids to braid them all together. And we would take those little braids and we would braid those braids together to make a bigger braid and vice versa until we got a rope that was big and strong enough that we actually used a truck to pull down a tree with a woven grass rope that took about 20 people, maybe an hour to weave. And 50,000 years ago, the sea levels continue to drop. As the land bridges start to rise up, the glaciers are still getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's producing more land bridges for us to get places. And by 50,000 years ago, Indonesia, Australia, and the Philippines are occupied by humans. Homo Florences, who had a mix of Homo sapien and non-Homo sapien traits. They had small teeth like humans, but their foot bones were more basal. They looked a lot more gorilla-like, more like species from 3 million years ago. They lived in the modern-day Philippines, and they went extinct at about the time that we arrived. Same story with Homo Florences, also nicknamed the Hobbits, because they were very morphologically similar to Homo sapiens, except they were very short, like hobbits. They were living in Indonesia, and they started to disappear by the time we arrived. This extinction of hobbits also coincides with the extinction of other local animals, such as the Indonesian pygmy elephant, which is about the size of a cow. We may have just moved into the ruins of the civilization of this Homo Florences, because they were hit by a volcano and that caused a mass extinction surrounding them. Maybe we kicked them while they were down and we moved into the ruins of their civilization, but either way, they disappeared and we arrived in Indonesia fully about 50,000 years ago. About 45,000 years ago, humanity finds a route through Turkey into glacially frozen Europe. And we find an old friend for a second time, the Neanderthals. We met Neanderthals in the east before, but now we're meeting them in the west. And these Neanderthals are far more adapted to live in these cold climates. And we pick up a lot of their technology to survive in these areas also.
So, so far, Homo sapiens are kind of like the English language, where we'll just, kill anything that we don't like and steal everything that we do.
Well, there's no real evidence that we, killed these populations. It just happens again and again that we arrive, their populations decline, and then they disappear. I'm not sure if that's us, competing for food resources or if we're going on the offensive and actually killing things we run across. About 42,000 years ago, we start to make fish hooks. We use the rope that we previously invented and we attach it to these little fish hooks. The first ones found from 42,000 years ago were polished pieces of shellfish, carved to be the classic J shape. At the site it was discovered in, it was found that early humans were actually hunting in deep water. So we didn't even find humans hunting in shallower waters first. Our first evidence of humans fishing was them fishing in deep water. And I found evidence that they were fishing for tuna. And they occasionally caught sharks and rays to eat, which is big fish for, Paleolithic man.
Hey, do you know why shrimp never give a reach around?
Why is that?
Because they're shellfish.
Boo.
Ooh, get out.
Screw you all, that was good.
Where's Sage? I need Sage here to tell you to get out. I miss her. Where is she?
With her permission, we should definitely patch in a version of her yelling at me to get out. That does sound about right.
Get out.
About 40,000 years ago, we begin to use musical instruments to enhance our music, I'll say. Humanity's relationship to music in the ancient world has always been mysterious. It's not like we could take a record player or a tape recorder back into 40,000 BC and record what they were singing and what kind of music they were making, but regardless, evidence shows that about 40,000 years ago, we start to find evidence of musical instruments, including ivory and bird bone flutes.
This flute is only one of 8 in all so far recovered from this area of southwestern Germany. The caves here have no paintings, but yield many other objects of art.
In this cave, the Geisenklösterle cave, many very important findings from the Ice Age were made. We found some little ivory statues of bear and mammoth, a very tiny mammoth, very lovely. And in 1992, I was part of the excavation team. People lived here about 40,000 years back in time. And in that time, it was very cold here because the Alp mountains were covered by a glacier about 2,500 meters thick. And in the valley down there, reindeer and mammoths were passing, and it was very cold. And that's the reason why I'm dressed up like an Inuit. We presume that in this way, the people of the Ice Age were clothed by reindeer fur and boots made of reindeer fur and reindeer leather, because otherwise you couldn't stand the cold. One of the most important finds we made in this cave was a very tiny flute made out of the radius of a vulture. Astonishing on this flute is that it is pentatonic. And this is the same tonality we are used to hear today. And if you like, I'll try to play some small tunes for you. And when I first reconstructed the instrument, tried to play some tunes, I came across these ones. Sounds a little bit like Star Spangled Banner.
About 40,000 years ago in South Africa, we began to mine. First, we started to dig up coal. Coal is a natural fire starter, easy to understand why the early humans wanted it. Something else that we started harvesting was gold and silver and copper. We didn't have fires hot enough to smelt these things yet, but these are things that can be cold forged, which means if you can get it out of the ore, if you can break apart the ore to get at the metal inside, you can smack it with rocks and basically form it to a shape you want using just rocks, using just hitting it at room temperature until it deforms into a shape you want. If you've ever been to the fair and you put a copper penny into one of those like penny flatteners, that's similar to cold forging, although I don't think pennies are made of copper.
I believe they're a good chunk of zinc now. Well, and in Canada they don't exist, but...
Also 40,000 years ago, we started to domesticate dogs. We were likely feeding friendly wolves outside of our campsites for many years before this. It makes sense that wolves might start to be attracted to humans because we have lots of cooking meat and nice smells. Maybe if those dogs or wolves acted cute, we would feed them. But dogs became distinct genetically from wolves about 40,000 years ago. And humans began to keep them in their tribes permanently. We housed them, we fed them, we started breeding them to produce traits we wanted. And we even started throwing funerals for our dogs. So when our dogs were buried, we often buried things with them that we would only bury with other humans otherwise.
So it's in the context of hunter-gatherers. This is where dogs were domesticated. And we have to think about dogs, the only large carnivore ever domesticated. In the context of hunter-gatherers, it must have done something different than most of our other domesticates that were domesticated in association with agriculture. Also, population size. We can reconstruct that by analytical techniques. And it turns out that actually the common ancestor of dogs and wolves, the effective size, the sort of genetic size, was extremely large. If we look at the effective size today of dogs, something like 2,000. Wolves also very small, and golden jackal very small. This is similar to the situation in humans, where our effective size is on the order of 10,000, even though there are billions of us on Earth. That's because the expansion is very recent. Similarly is the case with dogs. And what it means is that the population of wolves from which dogs evolved was much larger than the effective size of wolves today. So we can't compare modern wolves with dogs. We have to compare this ancient population, and that means the bottleneck, the genetic bottleneck during domestication was much larger than we thought. It isn't just one nice clean speciation event. Actually, dogs interbreed with wild wolves. You know, all dogs today aren't kept on a leash, neither were they in the past. They were roaming about freely and meeting up with wolves and exchanging genes. Basenji, with Israeli wolf, and even golden jackals and wolves. So admixture confounds our ability to reconstruct the ancestry of dogs. Dogs evolved with migratory hunter-gatherers. That is the evolutionary context we have to begin with to try to understand how dogs evolved. And we feel it has something to do with wolves adapting the habit of following humans around, and that caused them to be reproductively isolated from wolves that were resident and territorial. And that's the case actually in the high Arctic today, where we have migratory wolves following the Barren Ground caribou, and we have resident wolves that live in the same places but don't migrate. They are reproductively isolated.
Dogs were very clearly the very first domestic animal, and they're the only animal that precedes the advent of settled agriculture. But once you have dogs, the concept of domestication is something that is now within your brain. Agriculture and settling down and now existing and becoming dependent on a range of plants and animals becomes something that is now much more feasible. Most animals were domesticated just on a single occasion from a single wild population.
This process can take thousands of generations, and then at some point, humans may realize that, well, we have this relatively friendly animal that lives next to us. What if we start breeding it? And what if we start bringing it in our settlement and choose who is going to breed with?
The speed with which and the ease with which we can now generate ancient genomes is staggering. We just go, oh, well, I don't want to wonder. I don't want to suppose. I don't want to speculate about what happened. I just want to watch the movie.
40,000 years ago, Neanderthals all over the world started to decline as humans began to seriously expand. We were expanding into the west and into the east. We were poking into Europe pretty far, and the more we poked in, the more the Neanderthal populations declined. I'm not sure if it's humanity that wiped them out. Again, there's no definitive evidence, but it's that mysterious thing where the farther we spread, the more prolific we become. The homos that we live beside seem to decline in population. There's some evidence that their clothing and tools were good, but just they weren't developing them as quickly as humans were. We seem to be able to innovate and develop things much faster than Neanderthals, who were able to invent and adapt not as fast as us. So as the climate continued to change, they might not have been able to adapt as much. But there was some secondary factor, some second thing that was driving them to become extinct, because as you look at Neanderthals near the end of their histories, they start to get more and more inbred, which means their family units, their tribes were becoming smaller and smaller, and they had harder problems finding other Neanderthals to interbreed with. And they quietly went extinct about 40,000 years ago.
So we ask the question now, why are we still here? We've seen 8 different species that were here in the last 300,000 years. We lived together for hundreds of thousands of years. We worked together. We had families together. We did everything together in a lot of cases. We must have shared cultures because we were transmitting information about different technologies from one to the other. What happened? Where did they go? Why did they go? Were we smarter? I don't know. Neanderthals had a larger brain in some cases than we did. Maybe they were smarter than we were. Hard to say. Were we faster than they were? No, we're probably about the same as all the other genus Homo individuals at that time. We were all about the same speed. Were we stronger? Nope, we definitely weren't stronger. Neanderthals were very much stronger. Was there a sense of altruism that existed within a group of individuals that would have made their survival longer and better because we took care of each other? We see the evidence of that in Homo erectus and Neanderthals as well. And so the aspects of altruism are there early on in our development. So that wasn't it. Or was it something else? Was it something almost harder to define, harder to locate in the fossil record, harder to locate when we're looking at them physically and trying to interpolate what's taking place? Was it foresight and planning through different stages, through a mature culture? Was it the ability to take information, ingest the information, and then come up with something new and different? Is that what it was? Because we can do that. We don't know that they could. They had culture, they had intelligence, they had all kinds of aspects of life that we look at that would help them live. But as far as we know, this aspect of the ability to project into the future, to make decisions based on something that doesn't happen, it hasn't happened, to make decisions on something we can't see, to make decisions on things that may or may never happen, but something we need to know about, may have been unique to us. Because over time, we continue to evolve. None of our ancestors did. They got to a point, and that was it. They stopped. Neanderthals were the same way for 250 to 300,000 years. Same points, same everything. They hunted the same way. They did everything the same way. All of these different ancestors we're talking about did that, except for us. We got to a point where we started building technology. It took us a while. It took us a long while, several 100,000 years. We were pretty much along in the same lines as everybody else that we were living with. But about 80, 70,000 years ago, we began looking at things differently. For some very sundry reasons I don't want to get into here, but we started looking at things differently. We started valuing each other. We began to communicate with each other and respect each other for the ability to communicate. And then we developed technology. Our technology of the atlatl, which is a spear thrower, and the bow is a different technology than any other ancestors had. We had the ability to kill from a distance. We had the ability to get our meat in almost any environment, whereas our ancestors couldn't. Our ancestors were stuck in the environment they were at. If things changed, if the climate changed, if the environment changed, they had no tools to adapt. They couldn't survive in some of those areas. We could. We could get game anywhere. We could find game. We could plan the hunts. We could determine where we were going to go, who was going to go, why they were going to go there. We could put all this together with our technology and advance our species and cover the planet. Not just the old world, but the new world as well. Our species is the only one that's been on this continent that we know of. And so this may be why we're still here, is because we can do those things those other ancestors could not. We could progress anywhere, and we can still do that.
About 35,000 years ago, oil lamps are starting to be used by humanity. They started very simply. They were just little dugouts that were made in clay, and animal fat was put in and lit a fire, but we started to have artificial light, which extended our daytime. Maybe we were able to work on stuff later into the night than we were able to before, because we had this portable little lamp that we could carry around with us, just made of a little dish of clay, round patty of wet clay. We still hadn't discovered how to make a fire hot enough to properly cast the clay into like some pottery yet. About 35,000 years ago, we also started to get good at trapping. We used small bits of wood, flint, rope, and string, and other tech we had at the time to make traps to kill and capture small animals. Trapping allowed one person to catch more animals than they would be able to just running around with a spear or a bow and arrow or stuff like that. It increased our ability to collect more food per person, which allowed us to go farther. The better fed we are, the more we're able to dedicate time to other things. About 30,000 years ago, we find evidence that Stone Age people are starting to grind grains to make them more edible. So we're finding wild oats and barley, and we're starting to use mortars and pestles, starting versions of them to grind up this grain. Something that we weren't able to eat before because we didn't know how to break it down is now starting to enter the stuff that we can eat. 29,000 years ago, the first evidence of us weaving many ropes together to make a fishing net. Fishing nets do a similar job as animals, animal traps on land. They allow a single fisherman to capture many more fish than he would be able to with a single fishing line. And humans were, again, improving our ability to hoard food.
It's often forgotten that we're the only hominids to make it to North America. There were Neanderthals and Denisovans and all our other cousins over in Asia and Europe and that part of the world, but we were the ones that made it over to North America, and we were starting the first little footsteps of that journey about 28,000 years ago.
We reach modern-day Russia near the Arctic Circle, and we begin nearing the Bering Land Bridge between Russia and North America. We started making our first sex toys 27,000 years ago, found in ancient Germany. They were phallically shaped and made of polished and shaped siltstone.
I wonder if that's the first sex toys that existed, or like the first ones that we found. Because I can't imagine Homo Erectus with that kind of name wasn't using sex toys.
No, they definitely had sex toys.
Well, like I said in my disclaimer, all this is only what we discovered first. There's likely that we were doing all this stuff for years before, but we only have snapshots of our history because stuff doesn't last usually.
I mean, but also maybe this is the first time someone fashioned a sex toy. Maybe it was just like, grab that cactus with the fewer spines.
Oh yeah, there was evidence that ancient Egyptians were using bananas to masturbate, so there's 100% chance that humans earlier than this were using natural things to fuck themselves with. 26,000 years ago, woven plant fiber baskets, allowing a single person to carry and store more shit than they would otherwise be able to. When you don't have stuff to carry around, when you don't have a bag or a backpack or some kind of storage device, it's harder to carry things that you might need. All these tools that we've been developing throughout this story, we can only take so many of them with us with the two hands we have. And here we start to see evidence of humans making baskets to carry stuff with them. It also enabled some primitive forms of trade to develop. Because if you can carry way more stuff than you need, maybe you can lay that out somewhere and start to barter for different things with your fellow ancient man.
So capitalism started with a basket. Good to know.
Capitalism doesn't start with a basket. You still own the means of production. That's not capitalism. Trade is not inherently capitalist. Capitalism is when you separate yourself from the production. Whereas you're making the basket, you're carrying the tools you made, and you trade with somebody else for the tools they made out of their baskets. That's just trade. That's not capitalism.
If you had three guys underneath you collecting coconuts, and you traded all the coconuts that they collected for 5 cows, and you gave them 1 cow and kept 4 because you're the guy that organized the trade, that would be more like capitalism.
Yeah, that would be capitalism.
Yeah, and similarly, our ability to carry things improved even more. So 26,000 years ago, we had baskets. 20,000 years ago, in ancient China, we started making pottery. These hard clay things. So baskets, not very good for holding liquids, not very good for holding powders. But with the invention of pottery, we were soon able to transport liquids and powders and things that weren't able to be carried in a basket. Pottery was also better for long-term storage of things. Long-term storage of oils and grains and whatever else we could collect from the environment.
Can I tell a pottery story? I was in grade 10 art class, and we had to make these things called pinch pot bears. It's very difficult for me to describe exactly what they are, but basically they're hollow balls of clay that you would stick together into the shape of a bear, and then you had to poke little holes in their back so that hot gases could escape when they were fired in the kiln. But some dumbass, a guy named Andrew Spagrud, this is a real person, I'm going to see him at our class reunion next year, did not put holes in the backside of his pinch pot bear, and his pinch pot bear was put in the center of the kiln, and it exploded, and it destroyed every other pinch pot bear. And no one had pinch pot bears that year.
If you're listening, Leon remembers.
Leon fucking remembers.
We're here in the Neolithic houses at Stonehenge today, and I'm going to be making a replica of a Neolithic pot called grooved ware. This is the sort of pottery that was made here at the time when Stonehenge was being built, and I'm going to be trying to do it as close as I possibly can to the original pot. And I'm starting with a raw clay. It needs quite a bit of bashing to get the clay off there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to crush this down and I'm going to crush it to a sort of gravelly consistency so that I can add to this water and other additives. Now, grog is simply old fired pots, which are then crushed back down and added into the clay. But I'm also going to add some quartz. I've crushed the clay down, I've got it ready to go. Add some more of this clay to it, and the grog, and the quartz, and then we add water. And the water will start straight away to break down the clay. Pottery, the first material that humans changed from a natural form into an artificial material. Now the clay is workable and ready to be turned into a pot. I'm going to tear off a piece, put some spare to one side, and start to work this piece into a round ball of clay. I'm going to be working on a mat, starting off, flattening the clay down, working it outwards to make what is going to be the base of the pot. Working up towards the form of the pot that I want, which in this case is pretty much cylindrical, little barrel-shaped pot, this one really. This pot needs to be set aside now to dry, and it's going to have to dry for several days to get rid of all the moisture out of that clay before it's committed to the fire. It's the firing, that's going to turn this wet, soggy clay into solid ceramic pottery. Now this is a pot that has been drying for several days now, and I'm going to move it into the flames. The flames are starting to build nicely around the pot now, so it's warming considerably. Okay, that pot's now fully fired and ready to come out of the fire. I've allowed the fire to die down around it, and you can see the coloration on the surface of the pot from the fire, and the fact that this pot is now proper pottery.
So about 20,000 years ago, the glaciers begin to melt, revealing a quickly disappearing route to North America through the Bering Land Bridge. So there was a quickly closing window for humanity. The ice was melting, so there was a new path that was revealed. But the ice was melting, so that means that the seas are rising, which means that new path would soon be underwater. So human beings had a narrow window to travel across the narrow land bridge of just a couple thousand years, and they traveled it, and they made their way to North America about 20,000 years ago.
So the ice they walked was getting pretty thin, but the water was warm, but they still didn't want to swim?
Yeah, their world was heating up, so it was kind of on fire.
I need to interject again, and this is interjecting it bigly. It says, "Hey, Leon, you have more Neanderthal DNA than 66% of other customers."
Neat.
So I'm less Neanderthal than you.
That's fine. I am what I am.
This means that Richard's blood's gonna coagulate all the faster.
So much coagulation, like you have no idea.
Yeah, just poke some holes in them and see. 15,000 years ago, we eliminate another one of our fellow homos. The Denisovans go extinct. Just like the Neanderthals, they just started to decline. The last population survived in New Guinea until about 15,000 years ago, so fairly recently. And them being in that area and interbreeding with the humans for so long left, like I said, a big genetic imprint. People from Indonesia or the Philippines have up to 4% of their DNA being Denisovan.
I think everybody's heard of the Neanderthals, and these days I think everybody's heard of the Denisovans as well. First of all, let's take the Neanderthal. For a long time, it was held that the Neanderthals were stupid, primitive subhumans, shambling, lacking symbolism. Turns out that that's not true at all. The latest scientific evidence on the Neanderthals is that they were symbolic creatures, that they did do art, that they were in every sense human, and they were in every sense human because anatomically modern humans interbred with Neanderthals. You can't interbreed with another species. They clearly were human beings, but they looked rather different from us, and that's why certain populations in the world today still have 3 to 5% of Neanderthal DNA. Then in Russia, in Denisova cave, they find a single pinky bone from a little finger, and they do the DNA testing on it. They're able to get a complete genome from it, and what they discover is this isn't a Neanderthal. this isn't an anatomically modern human being. This is another human species who they named the Denisovans. They think they're more closely related to Neanderthals than they are to anatomically modern humans, but they're clearly another human species. And they also interbred with anatomically modern humans. And Denisovan DNA survives, interestingly enough. It survives predominantly in Australasia, in Papua New Guinea and amongst Australian Aborigines. Denisova Cave is a fascinating, beautiful place to visit. It's another example of a missing chapter in the human story that is beginning to be pieced together. It's obvious now that we were not alone, that there were multiple other human species who were human enough to interbreed with us and leave DNA. They left behind certain physical objects which are extremely hard to explain. One of them is a green stone bracelet. And that bracelet is in the form of a torque, which was therefore slipped on sideways onto the hand. It's not a full ring. And a hole has been drilled through the bracelet, and from that hole it's been possible to reconstruct that a pendant was hung. Then the archaeologists started to take a look in detail at the drill marks on that hole, and what they discovered was a huge anomaly, that was drilled with a stable, fixed drill, and it was drilled at extremely high speed. This is thought to be 40 or 50,000 years old. There is not supposed to have been any such technology in that period that was capable of drilling with a stable fixed drill, and yet there it is, and there it appears. So there are also incredible, very fine needles, bone needles that the Denisovans made, very long ones, which suggest that they were stitching very heavy stuff together. And the suggestion has been, were they making skin boats, for example, to use to navigate? That would explain how they managed to get themselves to Australia, where the largest amount of Denisovan DNA survives today. There's one of those needles. So there are indications of strangely out-of-place technology amongst the Denisovans, which is 20, 30,000 years earlier in the human story than it should be. Those kind of needles, that kind of bracelet, you could expect to find them in what archaeologists call the Neolithic. But to find it in the Paleolithic is very puzzling and very odd, and it suggests that the Denisovans were certainly not shambling subhumans, that they were refined creatures.
Can you find out what year they discovered the Denisovans, Jamie? Can you Google that real quick? I want to say it's in the 2000s, but I mean, imagine that human beings have been around for this long. Here we are in 2019, and within the last decade or so, they figured this out.
Yeah, we're discovering new stuff about ourselves. We're discovering that our story is much richer, much more textured, much more layered than we thought it was. It's not a simple story. It's a very complicated story, and we ourselves are a hybrid species. We are the result of interactions with all kinds of different looking human beings, and the end result is ourselves. So it's not just that we carry Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. In a sense, we are Neanderthals and Denisovans, and they are part of the anatomically modern human heritage. So the fact that this is only being discovered now, and that it's an incredibly important, it completely rewrites the story of our ancestry.
14.6 thousand years ago, the first evidence of bread shows up, a flat bread made of wild wheat, barley, and plant roots all ground together with some water, made in early Jordan, appeared on the archaeological record. At about the same time across the world, in Oregon, humans arrived in Middle America after crossing the land bridge about 6,000 years before. And 14,000 years ago, humanity invented war. This looks like the first mass warfare event in recorded human history. I'm sure there was lots before it, but this is our first one that we're able to get evidence for. It's about 61 individuals, all with similar but significant body trauma from being attacked by stone-tipped spears and arrows. 21 of them still have the stone-tipped spearheads and arrowheads embedded inside them. It looks like a collection of people who were warriors themselves because they had spears and clothing that looked like warriors' clothing with them, were attacked by another army and then buried in a mass grave. And 13,000 years ago, humans had traveled across America
through Central America and had arrived at even the southern points of South America. So by 13,000 years ago, we spread to as many places as we could throughout the world.
Something mysterious happened about 12,600 years ago. See, the Earth at that time was coming out of an ice age, starting to warm up. And then, at that time, something weird happened that plunged the Earth back into an ice age again for about another 1,200 years. In a relatively short amount of time, the temperature of the Earth plummeted by about 8 degrees Celsius. If you listen to our global warming episode, you know how much chaos 2 degrees Celsius off the norm throws. But this event, 12,600 years ago, which is still unexplained, still argued about in the realms of science, triggered sort of a second apocalyptic event. It made the Earth so much more colder. And you can see that in the fossil record and in our history. A bunch of human populations at the time were disrupted. They either disappeared or were diminished in number. And a lot of the megafauna that survived up until then died off in that 1,200 years of plunging back into the Ice Age. And then after that, things seemed to resume. The Earth seemed to recover from whatever happened and returned to coming out of an ice age. And the humans that emerged from that made the modern world.
Humanity became so prolific when it did because just as we finally arrive at every corner of the globe, the ice age ends at about 11.7 thousand years ago, revealing hundreds of thousands of new kilometers of land for humanity to occupy. And an increase in temperature and precipitation also shaped our landscape, and we began to domesticate things. First starting out in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, we started to produce 8 crops. These are known as the founder crops because these are the first crops that humanity ever domesticated. The first is flax. You can extract oil from it, known as linseed oil. It can be used as fiber for textile production. Another one is bitter vetch, which is a grain crop. It's easy to grow in shitty soil, and it produces a grain that's too bitter to eat raw, but when you boil it, it tastes good. The third one is chickpeas. It's a high-protein pea that can be made into a delicious mush. Yeah, it survives today. Like, chickpeas are ancient, and they're still real good.
Fucking hum it.
The next one is peas. The same ones you have in your garden, snap peas, like come in a pod, like hanging out all together. Yeah, those were one of the founder crops. Lentils was another one, produces a lens-shaped edible grain. Barley was another one, a cereal grain. Barley allowed us to actually start domesticating animals because it was really good for animal feed. Then 2 different wheats. One wheat that's a low-yield grain, but it'll grow just about anywhere, called einkorn wheat. And then there was emmer wheat, which has a higher yield but grows in only mountainous areas.
Tell me more about the barley again. I like barley. It's such a versatile crop. You can eat it, you can drink it. It's wonderful.
Oh, yeah. And early in our history, we just ground it up to make breads and food, but it took about 6,000 years for us to figure out how to make beer with it. And we made beer about 6,000 years ago from the barley we started domesticating 11,000 years ago.
Neat.
And then some other crops started to get domesticated. In New Guinea, they domesticated sugar. In China, they domesticated something called the bottle gourd in mass. The bottle gourd is like literally a bottle-shaped gourd that they use to transport and store things. Also in China, around the same time, they domesticated rice. In Iran, they started domesticating grapes, and they started making wine soon after, about 8,000 years ago. And about 7,000 years ago in Ecuador, they started domesticating a whole bunch of different crops that weren't found anywhere else, like chocolate, corn, beans, tomatoes, peanuts, cocoa, all appearing at about 7,000 years ago and being domesticated in South America. And with the rise of agriculture and us being able to produce way more food than we need and being able to store it and use it for other things, we started to be able to domesticate animals. If you want animals to be around to be your beasts of burden, you have to feed them and take care of them, or else they, will drop dead or not cooperate. And us jump-starting agriculture allowed us to do it.
It's not an abrupt isolation between the wild ancestor. Wolves gave rise to dogs. It's not an abrupt isolation, but rather there's crossing back and forth. And particularly in populations that are very closely associated with humans, such as rice or cattle, humans, when they migrate, and of course the human history is migrating from one place to another, lots of migrating populations, they took with them their domesticated animals and their domesticated plants, seeds of rice and all sorts of things. And then there would be hybridization and crossing with not only any wild ancestors, but also with perhaps sometimes other species. We see that in the domestication of cattle. So some very, very complicated evolutionary histories and very, very difficult to unravel. And some of the more recent work is really looking at these processes and trying to figure out how actually did domestication occur. One of the interesting things that Charles Darwin noted throughout his work on evolution is that there was this domestication syndrome in animals, a suite of characteristics that come together. And what he noticed was that domesticated animals tended to be docile. We understand how that happened. Those would be the individuals that you would want around you. But they also developed floppy ears, and nobody's selected for floppy ears. In border collies is exactly the opposite. You want pointed ears. Also, all of a sudden, he noticed that the wild ancestors might be uniform in color, but the domesticates had all kinds of variation in coat color. And did humans select for that? He didn't think so. It was sort of a mystery to him, a conundrum. Timing of reproduction changed. Skull shape has changed, and there's also a lot of size variation. So this has been a puzzle. How did all of this happen? And the thing that's remarkable is that we see it. Get ready for a lot of cute animal pictures. This is completely, just gratuitous animal pictures, but what it does show is what Charles Darwin noticed is here you got all these floppy ears. Here's a pointed ear one, but a little piglet with floppy ears, and that's sheep. That's a floppy-eared animal, a rabbit. And the other thing that you notice is that there's variation in color. And I think the rabbit and the little piglets are a good example of that. It's very common to see domesticated animals be spotty. So how does this all occur? The Darwin thought, and folks have thought, that this was the result of sort of the consequences of selection, but unintended consequences of selection. And so it's thought now that there were actually 3 different ways that domestication occurred. One was a group of organisms that were commensal. There was a commensal pathway. And that meant simply that there was wild animals that tended to associate with human habitations. Things like dogs and cats, because humans, of course, have waste. They have garbage piles, waste piles. Seeds will germinate there. Human habitation attracts small mammals, and predators are attracted to that. And so there was this suite of organisms around human habitations. One of the early hypotheses was that humans domesticated animals because people kept the young little baby animals as pets, and that now I think is less prominent, and there's much more thought that it was this commensal pathway. Then there was another pathway where the organisms, so dogs and cats would be an example of this. Another where the organisms were first prey. And that would be things such as horses and goats and sheep, that first humans hunted them, and then in the course of interacting with these species, they slowly began to manage the herds. They would, for example, only kill males and let females live because they would reproduce. And so there was this prey pathway, and we'll talk more about that. And then finally, just the directed pathway. in many cases with many organisms that are long-term domesticates, after a while, it's not inadvertent selection for something, it's very, very directed. So modern plant breeding, the breeding of dogs and horses, all of this is now very conscious selection, artificial selection. And this is interesting because we are domesticating, even as we speak, some new species.
The first animal to be domesticated after dogs, like a long ways back, were cats. And it made sense. The rise in agriculture made it possible for cities and settlements to start forming. We had enough food concentrated in one place to feed a city's worth of people. So people started to form cities. And it also had a lot of advantages of having all our technology and resources concentrated at one area. And with us concentrating all that in one area, we brought rodents. You know, if you store a bunch of grain in some building in ancient Mesopotamia, the rats and mice are going to come. And following after the rats and the mice were the cats. Cats pretty much arrived on their own. They saw the advantage that humans had given them, basically baiting what they considered natural prey. And all we really had to do after that was shoo away or kill the mean ones and spoil and keep around the nice ones. And cats quickly adapted to being in human populations. Many animals followed after. So we had the agricultural revolution at about 11,000 years ago, and we started domesticating other animals in quick succession. In South Africa, they domesticated sheep about 11,000 years ago. In Turkey, they domesticated cattle. In Iran, they domesticated goats about 10,000 years ago. About 10,000 years ago in Asia, they domesticated chickens. Bees were domesticated for the first time about 9,000 years ago, giving the rise to honey production and meaderies. Pigs were domesticated about 8,500 years ago. In South America, they domesticated some different things. Actually, one of the earliest animals domesticated in South America were guinea pigs. Does anyone want to guess why?
They're fucking awesome.
I know why.
They are fucking awesome, and ancient South Americans also thought they were awesome for one.
Friends, not food.
They were delicious.
They're delicious and easy to raise. You can pick so many in a small space and then fry them.
Yeah.
Or roast them. Shish kebabs.
Not cool, man.
I agree that it would break my heart today to see guinea pigs being treated like that, but for people 7,000 years ago in South America, they were a valuable resource. Just a bunch of little cows up for the slaughter. Also in South America, they started to domesticate llamas and alpacas. Some other various animals started to be domesticated around the world at the same time. In modern-day Russia, horses were domesticated about 6,800 years ago. Camels and donkeys and beasts of burden were domesticated about 6,000 years ago as roads started to be created and trade networks started to open up. And silkworms and the silk that came with them were domesticated in China about 5,000 years ago. At this time is when the Neolithic Revolution really kicked into high gear. It's the end of the Paleolithic Age, a Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age is where we put everything together. So we have a lot of tools that are able to obtain food and shape our environment, and we are able to use them to jumpstart agriculture and animal domestication. And once we had cities and agriculture and animal domestication, our society started to go into warp drive. There was only so many jobs you could have before this. You could be the hunter or the gatherer. Maybe you could be the stone tool guy in some societies if they were big enough. Maybe you could be like the fisherman guy. But when cities started to form, all these different job opportunities opened up. People could now dedicate their entire lives, if they wanted to rope making. And suddenly ropes became more sophisticated and started developing. Somebody could dedicate their entire life to, say, cooking or bread making. And suddenly the different things we could do with grains and bread and different cereal crops began to develop. And advancement started to come up in quick succession. We started to build roads, brew beer. We invented the wheel. We invented plumbing. We had massive public work projects like constructing a seawall. Monuments and megaliths started to go up. We started to tattoo each other. And our ability to innovate and invent things was at an all-time high.
One of the biggest transitions in human history is the transition from hunting and gathering to herding and cereal agriculture. And what we realize now is that we're really talking about change, and it's not necessarily all good, all positive, all forward-looking. It's an issue of trade-offs. Animals, and along with cereal grains, provide the economic basis for the emergence of more complex societies in later prehistory and early history. So it really allows us to understand the pace and development of human cultural evolution. If you are a mobile population, you can get up and move and leave everything behind. But if you are living in an area where you have permanent houses, where you're living in close proximity to animals, the potential for disease is certainly great.
One of the things happened with the Neolithic is we are changing the genomes of other animals. And while doing so, we are creating these new ecologies. And that whole ecology is attracting new type of life, including all the parasites and pathogens that would otherwise not be able to flourish.
You know, there are lots of reasons to think that in many ways, hunter-gatherers may have been healthier than early Neolithic people.
It is possible that things like teeth decay, some issues with bone development may be increased in Neolithic populations as compared to the hunter-gatherer populations. And in fact, it is also plausible the things that we are dealing with right now, like obesity and diabetes and several other metabolic disorders, may be because our diets have changed dramatically starting with the Neolithic transition.
I think we're overwhelmed with the idea of progress. When we look at the hunter-gatherer and even the early farming populations, you're looking at societies where the differences in status, power, and wealth were relatively limited. And when we look today and, you know, a half dozen billionaires own more than the rest of the world, that's the sort of thing that just didn't happen. Things like World War I and World War II are unthinkable without the complex societies that farming produced.
That understanding of the hunter-gatherers as this monolithic entity where everybody there, this egalitarian, peace-loving, nice people that are doing their own thing and hunting and gathering peacefully in line with nature. That's probably not the case. There may be some hunter-gatherer societies exactly like that, and there may be others that may be violent and may have issues with that doesn't fit with our moral constructs of today.
What advantages did Neolithic people have? Ultimately, their populations grew faster, so there's strength in numbers, and again, it provided the basis for the emergence of progressively more complex societies.
It's a great thing that we managed to create all the science and technology and all the arts and literature that we managed to do. That kind of complicated cultural accomplishments would not have been possible without agriculture. I think it is important to communicate the importance of major narratives. But even though we know a lot about the past, we don't know everything. And the more we know, the more complicated and diverse and interesting it becomes.
That's kind of the end of the story of this episode, us ending on a high note. We're standing here at about 3,000 years ago, about 297,000 years from our beginning. Just standing at the edge of the Bronze Age. All the other human species we walk beside have now been eliminated. They've gone extinct by our hand or otherwise, and we're the last Homo, the last humans to survive. At about 3,000 years ago, we stand alone, and we are entering the Bronze Age, an age that will show humanity and population explode. Just to come to a mysterious end a few thousand years later. In my next episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off, and I'm going to start to talk about the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse.
I'm still upset about the guinea pigs.
I found pictures. They still eat them in Peru.
I know they do. Do you know that there's music specifically for guinea pigs available on YouTube?
Yeah, it seems very Western.
In India, they would call us savages for eating cows because they consider cows are very intelligent and loving, and they form friendships with humans. And
pigs are as intelligent as dogs, but there's a pork roast in the fridge.
At the end of this, I can't help but feel like fragile. Like we have 7 billion of us on Earth now. Actually, how many billion? I don't even know.
Yeah, about 7 billion.
Yeah, we have about 7 billion humans. We're one of the most prolific species to have ever lived. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, but we could have just as easily been one of the species wiped out, and some descendant of like Homo Florences could have like been the dominant Homo. But
it can still happen. We can still run ourselves to extinction,
which is likely. Tune into our global warming episode for that. Or just, nuclear warhead stuff, that fun.
Or just
look outside.
The news.
Yeah, look outside, watch the news.
Yeah, I think we're going on a descent here. We had our glory period, and maybe we're not done with apocalypses quite yet.
I, for one, welcome our new ant overlords.
True.
That'll be a glorious new chapter in humanity. But
thank you, Kent Brock.
Until next time, I've been Ood Gallifrey with the Occultae Veritatis podcast, and in distance recording with me,
Leon Filger,
Richard Bigley,
and the Soundboard Demon.
Alrighty, see you next time. Au revoir.
Good night.
Night.
Hey, this is Scott. You just listened to an amazing episode of the Occultae Veritatis podcast. They're an amazing crew. I love coming on it and talking about all the weird things they talk about. You can find me on YouTube at Pinko Punko. My handle on Twitter and TikTok is YouCaughtScott, although if you look for Pinko Punko, you'll probably find me there too. I do tons of stuff on my channel. I'm in the midst of a series on the Canadian history of gun control. And, I just generally talk about leftism, communism, and all that fun stuff there. But I also run my own solo project as a band. It's called the Tar Sands. And it's kind of like this underground garage noise punk that I do all by myself. Pretty big fan of it myself, but that's why I'm making it. This one's called Unwind off of my first album, Unfiltered, and I think it's definitely one of the tracks that holds up the best. I still listen to it, but that's because I'm a narcissist. You can find it on Bandcamp if you want, or just, follow my accounts, and then just ask me. I'm happy to hand it on over. Here you go. Enjoy.
Show
Hello and welcome to yet another after show. Now we return to Dr. Avocado. If you were listening to the after show a couple episodes ago, you learned that Dr. Avocado loved the drinking stories we told on a previous episode and wanted to send us a few of his own, and I'll be reading the second one of those stories. A fan of the show, Dr. Avocado writes, Story number 2. For my 20th birthday, my girlfriend, now wife, we'll call her Mrs. Avocado, set up a double birthday with some friends of ours. His birthday was 2 days after mine. It was in Asquith, which is a city very close to Saskatoon. Dr. Avocado, are you local? Which I'm sure you all know where that is. I think we do. And we had about 6 or 7 of us there, and I had started to drink, so Mrs. Avocado and the other girl organizer said, hey, let's make chicken wings. And when they came out, I had been playing beer pongs with shots of Captain instead of beer, so I was fairly tipsy. And they put the plate out, and I ate a few, and they looked at them and said, I think they're a little undercooked. And being drunk, I said, no way, they're hot in the middle, they're good. Well, after that, no one really ate except me, and that night I couldn't stop puking. I couldn't keep anything down. Nothing. Fast forward to 8 o'clock the next morning, when Mrs. Avocado wanted to leave, I was still so fucked up that I couldn't see straight. So I said, well, either you drive, she only had her learners, or we stay here. So she drove us home, and the whole way I had to stare at either the dash or the roof while lying down, or I would have been puking all over the inside of the car. A few days later, I found out the chicken wings were frozen raw and cooked at like 300 for 20 minutes. I don't know what you know about cooking, but they were 100% raw on the inside, and I probably ate 1.5 pounds of them. To which I told her she would have told me that little bit. Even drunk, I would have told them to put them back in the oven. So she basically tried to kill me by accident. This was the single worst night and morning of my entire life to date, which I think means I'm still doing all right. Yeah, thank you for writing in, Dr. Avocado. We'll tell your third and final drinking story. I'm glad you survived that 1.5 pounds of raw wings. Yeah. If you would like to write in and have your letter read on the show, or if you would just like to provide feedback or yell at us for something we got wrong, feedback at ovpod.ca. That's it for me. Thank you for sitting through this entire 2-hour discussion on the birth of humanity, but we're not done with history yet. Come back next week where we see where we end up. The Bronze Age, and the apocalypse that followed soon after. See you next time.